Okay, now we're going to talk about one of my favorite tools in Lightroom, and that is the HSL panel. The HSL panel stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance, and it's easily, hands down, one of the most powerful tools in Lightroom. In fact, I would say it's definitely one of the top 5 most useful or powerful tools that you can use in the program. So essentially what it is in this panel you can isolate specific colors and you can play around with them one by one. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, here we have an image that I have already edited. This is actually the branding image for my website, nizhoniphoto.com. And as you can see here, I really pushed the colors real far. I really pushed the envelope on this photo. That's what I was actually going for. But I selected this photo because it has almost every color, actually has every color in this HSL panel. So it'll be really easy to demonstrate how this panel works using this photo. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Again, hue, saturation, luminance. That's what we're working with in this panel. Hue, the definition of hue is just the characteristic of a color. So with hue, you can change how a color looks. With saturation, you obviously can increase or decrease the saturation of a specific color. And luminance, that is where you adjust the brightness of a color. Okay, so let's start with saturation because that's something that we all already understand pretty well. Uh, to work in this panel, there's a couple different ways that you can adjust these colors. One way is you can just go right down the slider and you can play around with it from there. So here you can see I am pulling the saturation out of my reds, and you can see in the image that the saturation is really just going down to gray in the reds. Now I can pull it all the way up to the top and my reds are becoming real deeply saturated. Okay, I can do the same thing with my oranges. You can see down where the oranges are starting to disappear when they're starting to get overly saturated. And you can essentially do the same thing with every slider and wind up with a black and white image. Okay, because that's what this panel does pretty much, is you can affect each and every color in your photo. Okay, let's go ahead and reset these sliders to go back to the normal setting. Okay, so that's one way to do it. You can go down each slider and you can play around with it. Now what I prefer to do is I like to click on it and I like to use the keyboard because it's, again, as I mentioned before, it's just an easier way to control what you're doing. You can also click on these numbers here and use the up and down keys to increase the saturation that way. Alright, the only thing you can't do is, unfortunately, you can't sift through the sliders with the sideways arrow keys. Okay, you can do that in the basic panel, but for some weird reason Adobe only lets you sift through those sliders in the basic panel and not the actual panel that you're using. I don't know why they do that. It seems like it's kind of a silly feature to leave out, but that's the way it is. So in this panel you have to actually click on the sliders. Okay, remember also you can double click on any name next to the slider to reset it. Okay, so the second way you can control the colors is to actually use this little tool here. And what this does is you can hover over the individual colors and look to the right in our panel. You can see that when I hover over a color, it actually tells me what color I'm using. You see, obviously here I'm in the blues. Here I'm in the, well, I'm red there. I'm more magenta here. And if I go down here, I'm more into the orange and yellows. This is really helpful if you don't really know what colors you're working with. You can just hover over it, because what will happen is if you're in an area where you're working with multiple colors, look at what's happening. When I click on a color, I can increase the saturation by dragging up on my mouse, and I can decrease it by dragging down. But look what's happening here. By clicking in this area, it's adjusting the blues and the purples at the same time. And that's because Lightroom is detecting blues and purples in this area. So this is kind of helpful if you're working with an area where you're not really sure what color you're working with. Okay? Now, the way I prefer to do it is, again, I like to use the keyboard. I just think it's a little bit easier. But I just like to go down and play around with each color individually. It's a little more tedious, but I like to do it that way. Colors are a really big deal for me in my photography, so I just want to go through and push my colors as far as they can go, okay, without going too far. Although you might argue with me on that, because this image has clearly got some really surreal colors going on, but hey, that's what I wanted to do. Alright, one last thing I will say about the saturation before we move on to luminance, and that is when you're adjusting the saturation, a general goal to go for is somewhere between 50 and 80. For most times you're going to find that that's the range where if you go past 60, you're going to start to see these colors start to pixelate when you zoom in. You can kind of see it here. Let's just pump these colors all the way up. If you look closely, you can see this kind of color granulation here, especially in the details. That's because we kind of went too far with the saturation. Now, in this image, again, I've already processed this, so I've already added a lot of saturation into this image to start with, so there's not much more saturation I can add until I start going too far with it, okay? But in general, I'd say that 50 to 80 is a good place to land on. But the best way to do it is when you're working with your colors, zoom in and adjust the saturation and get the colors to where you like how they look, but maybe pull it back a little bit below the point where you're really getting that granulation. Okay, and I'll kind of demonstrate that later on in this video. Okay, so that's saturation. Let's move on to luminance. Again, luminance is adjusting the darkness and brightness of color. So let's go ahead and reset this. One thing I can tell is these blues are maybe just a touch too dark in this image. I kind of like to draw your eye's attention away from these blues and hopefully bring them up more towards the top of the frame into these magentas and purples. I think it's a lot more interesting with the texture and the varying purples and magentas here. Okay, so if I wanted to do that, I could actually brighten up my blues a little bit so that they're not as deep. And to do that, I can just click on blue. And when we're working with luminance, a negative value means that the color is going to get darker, right? But a positive value means it's going to get lighter. So let's go up to 20, plus 20. That's a little too strong, so I'll split the difference and maybe go to plus 10. So we can hit this toggle switch to look at a before and an after, and that made a pretty nice subtle difference there. Okay, just to show you what it looks like when we play around with the slider. This is something that luminance, I don't really use it too often, but one useful thing with luminance, if you ever have a day sky that you really want to make pop a little more, a good trick is to bump up the saturation of the blues a little bit and drop the luminance of the blues just a tiny bit. So by brightening up the saturation and dropping the luminance a little bit, you're going to end up getting like a deeper, richer looking sky, and it's going to look really nice. So that's a little tip that you can keep in your back pocket for later. All right. Hues. Now, hues, something I don't really use too often. I mean, I'm not really sure exactly why you'd want to change the tone of the color. I mean, if you captured it correctly in the field, just go with it as it is naturally. However, you can kind of get these really artistic looking photos by playing around with the hue saturation. It's kind of cool the results that you can get. Okay, so you can see here with the reds, if we pull it all the way down to the left, our reds are turning more rosy purple, and to the right they're getting more yellowish, although that looks pretty ugly to me. The oranges are getting more rosy, and also they're kind of doing the same thing where they're turning into these really nasty looking blends between green and yellow. Don't really like that. What I do like with the blues is I like to sometimes shift the blue hue a little bit to the right, where it gives the blues more of a magenta tint almost. It looks really cool, and actually it blends in pretty nice with these colors up here. With hues, you just make these really tiny little adjustments. You don't have to go very strong. In fact, I'd recommend that when you're adjusting the hues, it's probably best to just click on the color and adjust these values one by one rather than using the slider. Okay? All right. Now, one more thing I'll point out. So you have the basic HSL panel, right? But you also have this color panel, and essentially all this is you can isolate a color and it will have all three options for you in the same panel, right? So you can click on the reds and we have the hue, saturation, and luminance right there. You can do the same thing with the yellows, the greens, and so on and so on. You can also click this all button and it will pull up all of the options in one panel. Which is kind of cool, but in all honesty, I end up just using the HSL panel. I think it's a little bit easier to do it this way. Let's see. Okay, black and whites. So this just turns your image into a black and white, and from here, let's see, by playing around with the colors, you're going to be deepening those existing colors in a black and white image. Okay. Now, with this slider, this little toggle switch, this is definitely a good thing to use here because you're not going to really be able to see what colors you're working with. So it's a lot easier to just maybe click on an area that you want to deepen a little bit. You could go down here. I think these colors are a little too deep and you can pull them down maybe just a little bit there. Okay, you can maybe even pull up these colors a little. So that's a really easy way to work with black and whites in the HSL panel. Okay, let's go ahead and reset all of this. And we are actually going to go into a new image, okay, to give you another little demonstration. Oh, kind of worked on this a little bit before. Sorry about that. All right, so here I have an image that I've already done all my post-processing to. You can go into the basic panel and you can see I've bumped up the contrast, I've played with the highlights and shadows, the whites and blacks, added quite a bit of clarity, plus 60, but also a lot of vibrance and a little bit of saturation. But I'm not quite done with the colors yet. I'd like to push these a little bit further. I want them to pop a little more out of the frame. So to do that, we will go into our HSL panel. Now again, you can choose to adjust your colors this way, but I prefer to just go one by one. All right. Now, a tactic I use when I'm working with the HSL panel and a lot of other panels is I call it pull down, pull up, and pull back. And by that, what I mean is, say for the reds. Okay, I'm going to pull down, I'm going to pull the saturation all the way out, then I'm going to pull it all the way up. And what that does is it shows me where these colors are. Okay, so I know what I'm working with. Now let's zoom in here. And again, you can see this, what's happened here is we're getting this real heavy pixelization around the colors. We don't really want that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pull back to the point where we're starting to see that pixelization disappear. Okay, so we're at plus 100, 80 looks a lot better, 60 looks really good, and I'm just going to pull back just a little bit. So there we're at plus 50. Okay, now we can hit the before and the after. You see it did make a pretty big difference in this photo just from that. Let's see the before and the after. You see the texture that it added into these clouds? But you know, looking at it from afar, I might actually drop this down just a little bit, maybe to 40. Kind of like that, a little bit more. Yeah, that's a lot better. All right, now let's do the oranges. We're going to pull down, pull up, and now we'll zoom in, and we will pull our oranges back to a better point. Let's see. All right, I kind of like where 60 is. Looks good. Before and an after. All right, maybe pull back a little more. The key with the HSL is to make subtle changes with the HSL. You don't want to make these really heavy-handed approaches with the HSL. Even though you are, like, again, you're pulling back, you're pulling up to really get a good understanding of what colors you're working with. And again, pull back to a reasonable level, and then pull it back just a little bit more. Okay, so that way you're going to make your colors pop really well, but you're not going to push them too far. Okay, yellows. Let's pull down, pull up, and you see at 100, we're not. This is another good example of where 100 might not be that bad of an idea. Let's do that again. Let's pull down, pull up. You see, 100, we're not really seeing any pixelization because there's not really a lot of detail in where these yellows are. Okay, because the detail is more up in these clouds. That's where you have to be more careful with the colors. Down in the horizon, where you're really, this area where the sun was really setting real powerfully, you don't have to worry so much about how far you go. So in this case, you can zoom back out and then just look at the image as a whole and see how you like it from there. I liked it at 100, but I'm going to pull it back to 80 and maybe just a little further, back to 70. Okay. There probably aren't any greens in this image. There aren't. So we're not really seeing any change there. And you know, now that I'm on this topic, this is kind of a little digression that I can go into. A lot of people have an issue with editing in RAW because they say, well, you're just doing things to the photo that weren't there in the first place. But this kind of proves against that point because, as you can see, we can't adjust the greens because we didn't capture any greens in the photo at all. You're only able to push colors that you captured in the frame and in the scene. Okay, so I'd kind of keep that in mind. If you have some hesitation of really pushing your photos far, just keep in mind that, I mean, you did capture those colors in nature, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't be able to work with them in post-processing. Okay, so my view is feel free to push those colors as far as you want within reason, because they did naturally exist in the scene. If you're able to work with them in post-processing, they were there in the scene. Okay, let's play around with the blues a little bit. Pull down. The blues are more of a subtle change, except when you go really high with the saturation. Okay, 100 is way too far. Let's split the difference down to at least 50, maybe even 40. Let's take a look at that. Let's do a before and an after, just focusing on the blues. I like that. Purples. All right, pull down, pull up. That's way too far. So we know we're going to split the difference and then some. So we'll go down to 40 and maybe even down to 20. 20 looks good, but we could probably sneak by with adding just a little bit more saturation. Let's see. I like this. I don't think we're losing any details in the clouds. We're not seeing a lot of pixelization, so I like that. And then the magentas. Okay. All right. I already showed you the magentas. Oh no, maybe that was the reds. Okay. I guess the reds and the magentas are very close to each other. Yeah, there we go. All right, a little more red saturation. Okay, let's do the magentas again. Pull up. All right. We'll zoom in. So we're definitely... Okay, so 60 is a good point where the colors are starting to blend really well. We're going to back off just a little bit and maybe just a little more. Okay, that looks good. So let's see the final before and after. Before and after. So as you can see, it's a subtle yet powerful change to our image. We really bumped up the saturation and in actuality the detail of this image, the detail in the clouds. We were able to really bring that out a lot more by working with this HSL panel. So that's it for now. I hope you found this helpful and stay tuned for more videos. See ya.